Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and with me today is Zandering. Zandering, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay. A little tired, but otherwise okay.
I can't even begin to imagine. I'm looking forward to the what is it? The Better Conference put on by Tang in Fort Worth, and for me that's 11 hours, and I am dreading it. Like, 20 hours. You're all wow. Uh, I'm
Well,
amazed.
2,500 miles since Sunday morning.
2,500 since Sunday, and what are you carrying, and where are you going with it?
I left from north of Seattle up by the Canadian border with utility cross arms, the little wooden cross arms that go on power poles that carry the power lines. And it's going down to Louisiana. I'm going to Hammond, Louisiana, which is northeast of New Orleans, directly east of Baton Rouge, so they can try and rebuild the electrical infrastructure down there and get power back. And because it's going to a disaster, there's been an officially declared disaster. The FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, has issued a disaster declaration allowing disaster relief loads to ignore or disregard hours of service to get loads there faster. Because otherwise it takes 4.5 days to take a load from all the way up at Washington, up by the Canadian border, all the way down essentially to the border of Alabama, if you're following hours of service. So they kind of need stuff a little faster than that.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I'm blown away. And I guess apparently, I just got notified. No, I guess Better's was postponed. So I've been under the weather and completely out of it for the last 4 weeks. So Better has been postponed. I have to look into that. So that's there you go. Good to know. Thank you for letting me know that. So today's show we were supposed to have a while back, and it's one I took what happened in Afghanistan quite personally. I think the U.S. has made a number of commitments there repeatedly. We have broken them repeatedly. Human rights disaster. It is a country in which half of the population lived in slavery, and I will obviously discuss that. If it turns out we can't win there, then we can't win there. I'm not expecting miracles, but on the flip side, we made a number of promises, and I think we probably could if we did it right. I think we're going to discuss that, but I listen. If we decide that we're not going to get involved for whatever reason, or if we decide the only reason we're going to get involved is partner terrorists, that's one thing. And let's be honest about it. If we decide we're going to make human rights commitments to other countries, say we are, I really kind of expect we're going to try to follow through those commitments. But I seem to be in the minority with that opinion. So our guest tonight is Pat Lowinger. He is a historian. I have been on a couple of streams with him. Stuff. We're very lucky to have him on. So, Pat, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good.
There he
Glad
is.
to be here. Thanks for having me. I don't know how much of a privilege it actually is, but I'll do my best.
It's a privilege to get anyone on. So we were talking about you saw obviously just the mad rush to get out of Afghanistan, first to get all our military troops out, and get whatever civilians that we had to whatever out. The suicide bombing at the airport, which I believe, if I recall, was in fact had the largest number of military casualties of any suicide bombing in Afghanistan. So, what were you thinking when you saw that?
Well, so as far as the destabilization of not only Afghanistan, but what it's going to mean to the larger region, I'm extremely concerned. But, we have basically a 20-year period to look over U.S. involvement in it. So, I'm a little cautious to use the word rapid, I think I would use the word eventual and erratic, leaving of the region. I mean, we were eventually going to leave. The fact that we left in a somewhat erratic manner is probably why we're seeing what we're seeing, and that's concerning. I like studying. You called me a historian, but more correctly, I'm an ancient historian. And this seems to be a theme.
Your age. Nobody's going to hold your age against you.
Right. But we're not the first modern power to go there, and we're not the first foreign power to go there and realize that the region of Afghanistan is problematic, from not only a military but a socio-political, and beyond that, even just the logistical concerns. It's pretty amazing. So, but it's also very troubling that we don't seem to be learning from history.
All right, we have a $5 super chat. My unfinished journey. A little over a year ago, I picked 𝐂𝐴𝐴𝐺 brain about trucking. I am now in CDL school. I take the CDL test the day after tomorrow. Congratulations! Thank you so much for joining us. But yeah, the complexities of trucking, I've learned a tremendous amount. Okay, Pat, your keyboard is real loud on the thing there. So.
Oh, is it? All right.
Yeah, I'm picking it up. It's amazing what I've learned. It's far more complicated, far more skill and a great deal of independence too than ever thought. But all right, so let's see. We've got Sinister Titan. So thank you all for joining us. So you had said that we aren't the first power to sort of run afoul of that. I know the famous one made famous by the movie Charlie Wilson's War is the Russians, in which we, of course, assisted as much as we could to have Russians, who were a superpower at the time, defeated in Afghanistan, in this country, where the strategy was essentially the same as caused us to have our loss in Vietnam. So I take it then that it's happened sort of prior to that. This is something that's sort of had a history in Afghanistan, and if so, why?
Well, I mean, we can all go back, to the, 4th century and 5th century BCE, when Persia started becoming involved in the region, and their initial attempt to conquer and bring into the Persian Empire that region. It's problematic. Even the Persians, who were, arguably an adjacent cultural group, had a real hard time dominating the region militarily, and then politically, it was a nightmare for them as well. The region seemed to be politically divided, and for that reason, for lack of a better term, from an anthropological standpoint, they're tribalist, right? They're tribal societies built on clannish familiarity, and that is problematic because these clans tend to line up against each other based on long-standing feuds rather than immediate political necessity sometimes. So what you would think would be a mutual offer, even going to the modern context, well, these people seem to be aligned with us in this village, so the next village over who have similar interests should also align, but they won't align because of a long-standing, for lack of a better term, blood feud with the one village over. So it makes gaining a plurality of allied activity to be problematic, even when you would think by an existential means they would be willing to work with each other. And some of those tribal disagreements go back longer than anybody's able to document. I think maybe even the people who started it forgot what it's all about, but they are willing to perpetuate it continually. And it's not saying that there aren't other places in the world that they do that as well, but it seems to be a common theme in Afghanistan.
Well, I think in the Middle East, and I think that's something that Americans have a hard time with. We are sort of plugged into what's happening geopolitically, and we have an idea of who our allies are and who other countries are and where our goals work together. But the Arabs and the Persians have been at each other's throats for 3,000 years, roughly.
Yeah.
And it's not something that there seems to be any easy way to change. And even if politically there may be an expedient reason for them to be allies, that it's tribalism is pretty fierce over there. Is that does the land itself also have anything to do with it? I mean, it seems like pretty rough terrain in general. I don't.
Yeah.
The military is easy.
Well, that's part of the problem is modern armies go in and even, by extension, the Persians were better being kind of a nuanced term, but even the Persians were typically better armed, better equipped than, the ancient Afghans. Alexander's army, when it went into Bactria, which we call the region in antiquity, considered itself to be the most modern army, most well-equipped, and most disciplined army of its age. You later have the Arab caliphates are going to expand into that region after the collapse of the Sassanid Persian Empire. Then you're going to have in the 13th century, it's the Mongols. Now, out of all the people that come to the region, the Mongols seem to be better at what we call nonlinear warfare. Like their style of fighting seemed to be probably one of the best at engaging the region, fighting the native Afghans. But even ultimately, that when the Mongol Empire collapses, the region slowly returns to control of the indigenous people. And then you have later the Mughal Empire with Timur. And that's in the 14th century. And then you have the Sikhs, and then the British, and then the Soviets try initially in the 1929 and 30, before later returning in 1979. So people going to the region, getting their ass kicked, and then having to leave seems to be pretty common. And what I mean by getting their ass kicked, even if they occupy the region for quite a while, ultimately the region assumes when you don't have a foreign projection of power, like, for example, the Greeks. The Greeks were relying on supply lines into Persia. Once the Greeks were unable to maintain those supply lines, get new colonists to move into the region to maintain that ethnic control over the larger but suppressed native population, that immediately broke down, and regional control was lost. And that seems to be a common theme in the region. I don't think any army or any empire or any government outlasts the Afghan people if they're foreign. I think that would be a fair statement on a historical analysis. What's happened time and time again, U.S. involvement in the region.
Why are so many people interested in that region then? Now the Soviets went in. Oh dear Lord, I'm trying to remember why the Soviets went in. It's been a while. But why have so many people?
In '79 it was to. It was '79. It was to support there was a civil war, basically a coup, and then faction had killed, I believe, the prime minister, and the Soviets went in basically because they were requested to by the emerging exiled government, and so they interjected themselves in the region. And that was the Red Army. That 2 years didn't go well for the Soviets. They withdrew, but at least when they left, for at least up until '79, there seemed to be various incarnations of independent and semi-independent Afghan rule in the region. But it was considered weak, and it was considered largely ineffectual to doing what they needed to have done, to emerge a stable government in the region.
And we have a five. I wanted to snag this. We have a $5 super chat from the Sinister Porpoise. Why be a trucker when you can be a systems analyst or underpaid? Substitutes are paid, right? So underpaid I guess.
I can answer that question.
Please.
The trucking industry has some of the lowest paid and some of the highest paid middle class people in it. So it really depends upon where and what you want to do. I mean, my business has gross revenues of $300,000 a year. So, I mean, you can make a hell of a lot of money, or you can work for peanuts, and it really runs the gambit.
Well, I'm I don't want to return to substitute teaching again. It doesn't pay well for the aggravation.
Yay!
Yeah.
No, you're not going to get rich being a teacher.
Yeah, no. Well, teachers get paid more than people think they do, but not when you break it down by hour. When I was working at Westboro, I was teaching computer science at the high school level, and it was a great starting pay, really, for any job. But it when you broke it down to the curriculum, a lot of other stuff, I was getting paid $12 and $15 an hour. And if summers weren't off because that's I had to write curriculum. I was but all right. So where were we? We were let's see, discussing why people have been going into it. So I assume has what has made it enticing and made people think that they can go in and it's going to be a cakewalk. Countries get invaded reasonably frequently across the globe, but for a country that doesn't necessarily have a whole bunch of a geopolitical power or resources, they attract a lot of attention from a lot of other countries. Perhaps, I guess, mostly by proxy. Is that just to sort of wrap up what you were talking about? Why people seem to take
it's there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's there, right?
Yep.
I mean, if you think, if you just think from the stubbornness of nation building, that not America's not the United States isn't the only power that has decided that it has the vested interest to go into other regions and express its power through either being set up forms of government that would be aligned with their own ideology and or just controlling a region because it's adjacent or regionally significant. The problem is Afghanistan is extremely important if you want to dominate that region. It's just really hard to dominate externally. I don't want to say it's there, so that's why people are interested in it, but sometimes that is it. And Afghanistan isn't without redeeming features either. There are resources there that people look at and would ultimately like to exploit beyond just military conflict, right? I mean, we can talk about the drug trade, but just think about how intricately involved Afghanistan is in the exportation of opioids. Heroin is a major export from poppy production in the region. So this is something to think about. There's things there that people want, and controlling that region is pretty significant.
It was certainly a safe haven for terrorists, and at least in the more recent history. And I think there's a concern that, of course, it will be again. The Taliban looked away. Well, Osama bin Laden planned a number of attacks, including 9/11 from Afghanistan. Is there a reason that they didn't seem to particularly care that he was whacking other countries from there? And is there a reason that I mean, they don't seem to mind that the poppy is gonna attract attention. They don't seem to mind that the terrorism is going to attract attention. Is that
I just used? Oh, sorry.
No, please.
So it's not just, and I use the poppy as being a little bit pedantic to kind of show the fact that there are less legitimate things going on from an American perspective. But as far as mineral production, there's quite a bit, like chromium. There's several rare earths that are known in significant quantities in the region as well. So if you get the right mining company in there, they would be able to exploit the resources of Afghanistan as well. So to say there's not what I don't want to call legitimate, but what would seem more internationally legitimate reasons to be Afghanistan, I don't want to say that. But the region's largely based on a cultural tradition that I don't think a lot of Americans can get their head around. They aren't used to dealing with clannish / tribal societies that have certain just say non-American, non-Western concepts of hospitality, honor, tradition that sometimes becomes antithetical to a quote unquote Western democratic or Western self-governing model, right? It's there's a lot of things culturally in the region that Americans come in and they don't really understand. It takes time to learn. Understanding various regional identifiers is problematic.
So I think for many Americans, they'd assumed that the Taliban was actually the legitimate government of Afghanistan, and I think as the war ramped up there, we became more cognizant of the fact that they were not. What kind of government did they have before the Taliban, and what is the Taliban, and what did they do? All right, you're muted. You're also, there's a bit of a lag in the sound. I'm trying to figure out if that's on my end or if that's
yeah.
But
I think it might be on my end. So one of the issues in Afghanistan is that you can't talk politics without really talking social class and social status, right? So like in Afghanistan, one of the it's typically seen as a high and low. We talk in terms of rich or poor, but there are certain inter-ethnic relationships, right? Like it's a conglomeration of different ethnic groups, right? So you have everything from the Pashtuns, right, and other groups, but there is considered the hierarchy. Like you have the Pashtuns, and then you have people, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks. These are people that like have a social hierarchy, and then these social groups kind of clamor together for more mutual support. It would really, we're going outside my area of knowledge and expertise. I mean, really, we'd have to get someone who specializes within the anthropology and sociology of the region. But it's extremely complex, and it's extremely, the societal norms project it and maintain these hierarchical systems. So it's not just talking about there being social classes and then an American concept, rich and poor. There's also ethnic distinctions in social classes. Like, there's a people known as the Haraz. I'm going to say it wrong. The Hazarar that are, the Hazarar that are really considered the lowest of the low socially and they're a largely suppressed they're a suppressed ethnic group in Afghanistan. So there's a lot of things going on that people don't understand. First of all, it's a highly patriarchal society, right? So this is one of the problems, or several of the groups, right? So it's not an easy thing to do.
And they were a monarchy for a considerably long time too, as I recall. I don't know how long, but for a huge part of the history of at least the country itself, it was a monarchy until the last king was in fact kicked out by the well, he wasn't kicked out. He left on, I think it was dental surgery or something, and he was in England, and there was a coup while he was gone, and he returned. So what can you tell us about King Mohammed Zahir?
I really can't tell you a whole lot beyond what little bit I know in a modern context, right? So what happened regarding his former, whether or not he was a dedicated ally of the Soviets, that's hard to really determine. But that's that's part of the reason for their projection into the region, right? So America at that time period is seeing you got to think about the time period we're talking about, post World War II, projections of anybody that's pro-Soviet or even ambivalent to the Soviets is seen as a potential enemy, if not direct enemy, to U.S. territorial concerns. The British had a long history in the region prior to later Soviet involvement, right? I believe it's a quote by Mike Malloy, Afghanistan where empires go to die, and he's specifically referring to the British, I believe, in that commentary. One of several, but I think it was he was espousing Britain's involvement in the region. The kings seem to be required, though, to maintain alliances with these various ethnic groups, and within those hierarchical traditions, the leaders of those communities. And again, you're talking about a hierarchical, social, patriarchal system. So if you want to call them local leaders or tutelary heads of clan groups, that's part of the issue in Afghanistan. Is you have to get all of these, I'll use the term that people don't like, but you have to herd all the cats in Afghanistan. And that's part of the problem, is because many of what we see as an overarching regional concern, they look into localized concerns. And until you're able to address both region and localized, you're not going to be effective in the region. How do you deal with the oppressed minority, getting them to go on to, even though it's in their best interest, ultimately, when they're going to have to ally with people that are responsible for suppressing them for the last 200 years? At least that's their cultural memory, is that they're the group that the other group has suppressed. And for that reason, we're trying to unite them into a unified government or unified governmental system where they don't necessarily want to work with their neighbor because of longstanding ethnic tension in the region. I mean, again, it's a Sunni region, right? So the religion there is Sunni by, I believe, all or nearly all, right, of the region. So that's a problem as well, right? So projecting the wrong, even the wrong religious group could be something antithetical to what's going on.
One of the reasons that I wanted to bring up, I think that's an interesting point that I hadn't remembered about King Mohammed Zahir, which is that he was the one who actually went to the Russians and said, "I've been ousted. Can you help me get back?" And that was what got the U.S. first involved, saying, "Okay, let's help the Mujahideen." I don't know why I'm having that word. Mujahideen, is that
Mujahideen?
Oh wow, my brain process that word right now.
Right.
Fighters. Now we equipped them. We had to equip them with Soviet weaponry. We couldn't equip them with U.S. weaponry, because if we equipped them with U.S. weaponry, it would be obvious where they got the weapons from. So we had to buy the weapons, if I recall, through the Israelis, and then get them to those fighters so they could fight the Soviets. And then those weapons, many of them are the ones that the Taliban ended up having and against us, and so did Al-Qaeda. They eventually Al-Qaeda. But what I think most of us have this idea of Afghanistan as a Sharia caliphate, and actually it's a Sunni caliphate, really, I guess, but it's a caliphate state.
Well, just
yep. Please.
Right. I just want to add, so I had to check my notes because, again, but just to show you that, so the Hazars are a suppressed Shia sect, right? So that just tells you there's already ethnic and religious tension in the region. So it's not just one thing, it's many things, right? So, which makes them in opposition to several other groups, including the Tajiks and others who practice a different form of Islam.
Which is why we can usually find allies in someone. We did the same thing when we went into Iraq. We found allies in the Kurds, and because they do have this memory. And then, but on the flip side, it's these people that have the memory that we end up betraying in one way or another when we bail on the country. It's sort of my end game in this discussion. But what I find interesting is that we have this picture of the women in the hijab. You can only see their eyes, sometimes not even that, fully covered. And that's actually a more recent development in Afghanistan. And that really only happened once the Taliban came to power in 73, I want to say. I think that's about right when they kicked out 73, when they kicked out King Zahir. Before that, he had actually done a number of reforms, including a constitutional referendum, or not a referendum to rewrite the Constitution, turning it into a
Constitution.
into a democracy. So there would be free and fair elections. There would be egalitarianism across all genders. Everybody would have an equal right to vote. It would be a constitutional monarchy. There would be, let's see, what was the I have the reforms that he had actually proposed, and most of them he had already women's rights and universal suffrage, parliamentary system, and civil rights. These were all the reforms that he had already started and was well underway. Let's see, he had actually already gotten the Constitution in place, and again, free and fair elections, which would presumably that it'd still be a monarchy, so his line would still be intact, but he was going to be ceding a lot of power over. And this is what was lost when the Taliban came in. But we've shown pictures before of women wearing all of the what was at the time modern 70s attire, and you couldn't tell the difference between Anytown, USA, and Afghanistan and Kabul. You could not tell the difference. So I don't know. Yeah, please.
Well, that's an interesting piece of history from the American perspective, because when you're talking about places like Kabul, those pictures are very accurate. But what a lot of, and this isn't mine, I'm referring to other people's works and analysis. That was one view, but then there were regional areas that we could largely consider not only rural but remote, where groups like the Taliban that eventually give rise to the Taliban are already there. There was already a two-tier system of religious expression in Afghanistan long before the Taliban come to power. There were traditionalists. Again, we have a varied, even within, both Sunni and Shia sects, different attitudes towards integration, westernization, whatever you want to call it, expressions of what are Western norms and values that in certain regions of Afghanistan, they did not look, they were not quote unquote modern perceptions of what you were comparing to Kabul. So long before the king comes to power, and again, I do agree that if there would have been success establishing a constitutional or parliamentary monarchy, constitutional monarchy with a parliament, which I believe was going to be their system, it may have ultimately proved to be the best thing, but we'll never know, because ultimately we can conjecture all day, and what happened, and the failings of which show that the region is hard for even localized political powers. And you would think, who doesn't want a monarchy? Well, in a country where you have a religious system that's already got a lot of tension in it, a political and social system, which again, you can't take those two things apart in Afghanistan. There's already ethnic tension. Then you have mullahs and various religious leaders who are projecting ethnic tensions and religious tensions at the same time. It's a powder keg. I mean, it really is. I mean, it is problematic. I mean, ultimately, I think the only people that are going to solve Afghanistan's problems are the Afghans. And we may have to realize that as those looking from the outside in, that it may be too complex of a both social, ethnic, and religious issue for us to solve ourselves, or even help them solve it. And it may be somewhat...
Please.
Well, I was going to say, it may be somewhat condescending and elitist for us to even think that we have the right to do that, right?
Oh yeah, well, yeah, that's also an interesting discussion as to how far should we project whatever our own values are. So the at some point the U.S. Well, let's go up to 9/11. Everyone who was alive on 9/11, flashbulb memory, we remember exactly where we were and what happened. And I remember the 12th, we were already talking targets of retaliation. We were talking before the 12th, but the 12th is when we started in earnest. You couldn't avoid the discussion, and very quickly it came to this came from Afghanistan, and nobody had a whole bunch of any nuanced opinions about how or why, just that Afghanistan did this. And so we were saying, well, let's let's wipe Afghanistan off the face of the map. That's a tremendous amount of anger and hurt and this desire to engage right away. And 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷 has an interesting perspective on it, so I'll make sure we bring it in a minute. But
Yes.
well, yeah. Let's discuss that. Let's discuss your a bit on that, and then we'll ask the next question. How did the U.S. start?
Yeah, you mentioned you mentioned kind of having a flashbulb memory about where you were, what you were doing on 9/11, and mine's pretty interesting. I was in the Strait of Hormuz when 9/11 happened. Of course, it was evening there, just after sunset, so like 10 o'clock at night. And so we're going into the North Arabian Sea. I was in the Navy, going in to get fuel. We were just arrived to relieve the Enterprise battle group. So we had one and only one channel that we got live news feed from, and that was CNN on our ship. And that was fairly new. We didn't have it for the previous deployment. So they had just installed satellite television. So we watched all of the news coverage live, and all of the news going on about what was going on, and then as things moved on. And of course, as soon as that happened, and it kind of became clear that this wasn't an accident, we immediately raised our alert level. They rigged deceptive lighting on our ships. We lit off all of our engines and went to full speed to get into the UAE there at Dubai to get fuel, and then we immediately left the Gulf entirely. We went all the way back out into the Indian Ocean.
So, what were your thoughts when you realized that they were looking at immediate or reasonably close to immediate deployment in or around Afghanistan?
There was kind of a two-part thing. So, I mean, the battle group's got several thousand people in it. The aircraft carrier alone is carrying over 6,000 people. So there was many people in the battle group that actually knew people that lived in New York City, and some of the people in the battle group were from New York City. So you had this dual kind of tension of shock, and I need to figure out, if this has affected my family. So that was the very first part, was just kind of shock. And then they started talking about, the intelligence was saying that this was bin Laden that had done this, and that they figured he was in Afghanistan. And so now we're all sitting there going, now what's going to happen? I mean, we're getting our news from CNN. We're actually here with the entire battle group. They recalled the Enterprise battle group. They sent the forward deployed unit that's based in Yokosuka, Japan, which is the USS Kitty Hawk at the time. They shipped the Kitty Hawk over to us. I mean, it took them a little while to show up, and they shipped it without a naval air wing. They shipped it full of Army helicopters. So we're all sitting here learning what we're going to do and what the plan of attack and stuff is from TV, public consumption TV, instead of us having any idea. I'm sure, like the admiral on the Carl Vincent probably knew what was going on and was chatting, and they were developing all that stuff. But as far as the most of the people in the battle group, we had no idea what was going on. All we could do is watch what was going on television. They say, the president comes out and says we're going to go after Afghanistan, or they're talking about it, and we're going, it's like, okay, well, we're right here, and we haven't heard any of this stuff yet. So you had that kind of dual and shock too, and then so it was kind of that little bit of shock, very quiet lull where people were just trying to process, and then when they started talking about military actions, the people just going, so what does that mean for us? What are we going to do? It's really sucked. I really felt bad for the Enterprise battle group too, because they had just been there for 3 months and were leaving, getting ready to go home, and then they get recalled, and so now they're sitting there. Nobody knows how long they're going to be there. They're just now there indefinitely. So it was a very confusing time, because about the only real information we were getting about what was actually going on was from CNN.
Yeah, I was going to make a snide comment about my condolences with CNN, but actually, I mean, they've always been kind of the vanilla of newscasting, but especially back then, at least, it's far preferable to most other sources. Even today, it's preferable to Fox News. But all right, so 9/11 happens, and we decide that we're going to go in. So what was the mission in Afghanistan? What was the goal, and how was that sold to the American people, or was it advertised correctly and we just bought? So what's happening around that time? I feel all the easy questions go to Pat.
Yeah. So I don't think there was a clear objective other than initially to retaliate against the perceived perpetrators of 9/11, which was, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda was a group that was already, as far as intelligence was well known. We knew who Osama, as a government, we knew who Osama bin Laden was. He was identified, and it wasn't didn't take a whole lot of work. It's not like this big matrix board with arrows and dots and squiggles. It was pretty much a direct line. You could figure it out pretty quickly. In the intelligence community, when it happened, you made a comment earlier, it seemed like everybody knew who it was, and we were immediately moving on it. But then we, as a country, the Bush administration, in addition to how do we deal with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda more largely, how do we deal with the country that in theory had harbored and allowed this attack to occur? Do we hold Afghanistan regionally and as a political entity, if we wanted to call it that, do we hold them responsible for the actions of someone living in their country? It's interesting though, because I'm all about calling things the way I see them. We didn't hold Saudi Arabia to the same standard at the exact same time.
Jesus, no.
When we talk about, right, we knew who had attacked us. We knew what countries they were nationals of. One thing that we seemed to not really do too much conflation immediately after 9/11 was talk about how involved, a large number of Saudi nationals were, right?
All but one.
And particularly all but one, correct. And that seemed to be a story that was refocusing into Afghanistan and away from Saudi Arabia. Now, that's all hindsight now. But at the time, it seemed like the U.S. goal was to go in and remove Osama bin Laden immediately through military intervention. We were going to go to there to, when they say capture or kill, they mean kill and then bring his body back. And then, destroy as much of the infrastructure of Al-Qaeda as possible. And then whether or not Afghanistan was going to be a long-term regional military intervention and campaign didn't seem to be really clear at the beginning. You remember the first thing we did was send in special forces to coordinate with local, what we'd call warlords, right? This, again, we're going back to a social system that has seemed to work where we're one group against another, and we were immediately able to have gained some allies in the region because of disaffected groups. Mm-hmm. But we immediately got into proxy warfare in the region, using our allies against who we saw as the belligerents in the region. Particularly those that supported Al-Qaeda, right, or were Al-Qaeda themselves, and then the Taliban. So this is the issue, right? The Taliban allowed Osama bin Laden to be there and his group, and then now we can destroy the Taliban. But is the Taliban really the government of Afghanistan? Well, they're the most powerful group in Afghanistan. That doesn't necessarily mean they were in power because they were the most powerful. So we immediately started fighting a war very shortly after 9/11 through, again, limited operational groups, but, military forces, air support were going in to support what we saw as allied Afghan groups that were willing to help us fight not only the Taliban, but, help us ferret out Osama bin Laden. And eventually, the goal immediately was find him, shoot a drone at him, and blow him up in a cave, right? That seemed to be the goal of our U.S. foreign intelligence and military apparatus in the region, and it didn't pan out. He fled,
and on the
largely
and on the ground there too.
So what was that?
I was just going to say, that they were talking about just specifically going after Osama bin Laden, and which is, our mission was, at least as was told to us while we were there, because we started launching the missiles, we started launching airstrikes, and that's what we spent our entire deployment doing. And we sent, the the air wing went on hundreds of airstrike missions. We moved more ammunition. I was on the fast combat support ship for the area, so we resupplied. We're the ones that went into port and actually picked crap up and brought it back out to the rest of the fleet, which never went to port. First time since Vietnam that battle groups hadn't actually pulled into port. So it had been many decades since they'd had to have a beer day in a battle group, and we had 2 of them. Once you hit 45 days at sea, it's actually written up in the rules somewhere. They always say in the rules, but they never really point out exactly where that is. But the military personnel get to have a beer day, and the military provides all of its service members with 2 beers, free beers, and you have a big ass party. We had 2 of those. I got to have 3 because I ended up leapfrogging a couple of different ships while we were out there. But the number of Tomahawk cruise missiles. I mean, we shot our DDGs dry. I got to help co-launch a Tomahawk cruise missile. I mean, it was amazing the amount of firepower that. I mean, you always hear people talk about the power of the U.S. Navy. When you look at the actual ordnance that we sent, and since it all crossed our decks going to the other ships, and just the fact that we're tooling around a little square watching the ships around us launch missiles after missile after missile all night. And the entire thing we were supposed to do is we were wiping out critical infrastructure. We were taking out air bases that could possibly pose any kind of threat. We were trying to take out any place that might have surface-to-air capability at all, radar stations, and then we were taking out large cave complexes and just going after anybody we suspected or anybody they suspected. We weren't actually there. We were just launching them of being Al-Qaeda. And that's what we did for the first 3 months. That's all we did for the first 3 months. Once the Kitty Hawk arrived, carrying all of the Army helicopters, they started inserting special forces. We had 2 amphibious assault groups that come with us. Normally, a battle group has 1 that's kind of floating around it tangentially. They're full of Marines and special forces, and they're the ones that launch amphibious assault landing. It's kind of hard to do that since Afghanistan doesn't border the sea, so they had to put them on, get them over to the aircraft carrier. Then they were launching helicopters over and landing them into Afghanistan after they had essentially completely wiped out an area to secure it. They'd bring over, and that's how they started bringing people in. They started going out to try and to build forces to get more intel on the ground, to find out exactly where these people were hiding. Because my understanding is we didn't know exactly where he was, just this region. So, not quite the carpet bombing of the World War II, but with the same effect. And it's amazing to see the kind of firepower that a battle group can actually launch.
Well, yeah, interesting distinction, though, to dovetail what you just said and what Pat was saying earlier, which is, and Dick Cheney famously had said when they were planning this, he said he was trying to move on to Baghdad, what was it, Iraq, as quickly as possible after this. And when I don't remember if it was Shinseki or somebody had said, look, why don't we do this right in Afghanistan? Because there are no good targets in Afghanistan, which is an interesting observation, because that does seem to dovetail with what Pat was saying earlier, and I find it there's a kind of I suppose in poor-based joke, but an interesting observation, which is Afghanistan after you bombed it looked a lot like Afghanistan before you bombed it. It's somewhat of an unfair characterization, but on the flip side, if you have desperate or disparate organizations, groups living sort of on their own, you don't have a centralized infrastructure outside of the individual cities, and these groups build locally and or are living in caves or anything like that. Bombing it doesn't do the same thing that taking down two towers in New York does, and doesn't do the same thing that, say, Dresden in World War II. It doesn't matter how much firepower you bring in. It's a different area you're hitting. So does that seem right? Am I just sort of I guess what I'm trying to say is I was always frustrated by Dick Cheney's there are no good targets, where you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, then why are we there in the first place? But on the flip side, having this discussion now, I'm starting to see that in possibly a different light, where it's sort of, what exactly are you going to do in Afghanistan? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that was one of the reasons we launched so much ordnance. Was, it's like they don't have concentrated things to actually target. You're trying to hit very dispersed stuff all over the place that isn't very readily identifiable. Because at first, they're using essentially GPS and satellite imagery to try and target stuff. Because we don't really have anybody reliable on the ground. Normally, when we target things like cruise missiles into areas, we try to have people on the ground with laser targeting systems, where we actually point a laser at what we want that missile to hit, and that missile will hit it within about like 10 feet. But when you don't have that, you're now just giving it GPS coordinates, because we can launch cruise missiles can just go to a GPS coordinate and land. Unfortunately, okay, you're somewhere within a mile of there, depending upon how far it has to fly. I mean, the things are amazing that they can maneuver like they do, but not having consolidated targets meant we had to hit a heck of a lot of stuff. And that was one of the things that some of the older command structure was they couldn't believe how much ordnance we were actually launching into that. And there was a bit of wondering on our side, exactly what are we targeting and hitting? Because of course we can't see it. Now the admiral staff, I'm sure, has all of the intelligence and all of that stuff. And, but we could see some of the, I shouldn't say we, some people, if you had access to CIC, I got to go into, because I'm a quartermaster, I worked on the bridge, and I work in coordination with the OSs in CIC. So I was able to go and see of like the Carl Vincent, and also the Benfold, USS Benfold, which is a DDG. And so you can actually see some of the pictures and imagery that they've got up, and where they're targeting like cruise missiles, for example, or where they have swaths that they're going to have the strike group, the aerial strike group, usually all the F-18s going and targeting things. And it only took us a week to take out all of the visible structures that we would want to take out. And there was pretty much no more air control at all. I mean, there really wasn't beforehand either, but now they couldn't even track. Nobody in Afghanistan could even track us at all, because everything was gone. But so dispersed targets that it was very difficult to try and figure out what are we hitting, or did we even hit what we were aiming at.
Well, and the Soviets learned this in Afghanistan. We learned this in Vietnam, which is you actually can't. It always seems like you should be able to win a war from the air, but in the end, if they're dedicated, you can't. You need troops on the ground, and you need people. You need an invasion force of some kind, and so that's when I started to send its troops in. Now, we did find bin Laden. We found him in Pakistan, so he had been in Afghanistan. He had orchestrated from there. The Taliban was sheltering him, and we specifically said, we had demanded of them hand him over, and they said he's not here, which was a lie. Ostensibly, it was a lie. I suspect they knew, but given how Pat had described it, I suppose it is entirely possible that they didn't know. But my understanding is they must have known he was there. But nonetheless, eventually he was found in Pakistan, and we were obviously looking there, so we had some idea he might not be in the country. But we were also building things when we were there, and aside from air bases with Olympic-sized swimming pools, it appeared as if we were building with the intent to either stay or nation building. So I'd like to start with Pat and say, was that ever officially a goal? Was that unofficially a goal? Was that a pipe? When did that get on the table, and how?
Well, this has to do with continuity of plans from the top levels of the administration, right? Nation building can be discongruent, depend on whose model it is. It's not like we had a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, right? Resources were going into the country in order again, we were building infrastructure in the country. That's demonstrable. But how effective that infrastructure was going to be seems to be still a point of contention, right? building an Olympic-sized swimming pool sounds great, but we still had what we're going to call marginal communities where they didn't have running water or the basic infrastructure that we'd call today, right? So yes, it's nice that we were trying to build infrastructure in the country and bring it up to, again, a level that is being, the measuring metric to measure these things is a Western concept of, well, it's as good, this is not good, we want this for them, that for them. Modernization may not have been what Afghanistan needed as much as a reform of their political and social system, more so than just building bridges and building roads. The issue with Afghanistan being stable isn't whether or not the lights go on in Kabul. It's whether or not these various ethnic groups can work. I mean, not just live next to each other, but stop the ethnic tension, basically stop killing each other. And in some cases, to be fair, it's not always one group killing each other, it's one group suppressing the other. Were we going to be there in order to ensure that those type of ethnic, in many cases, ethnic cleansing, ethnic tensions, warfare, however you want to term it, but the social unrest in the region wasn't military. The U.S. military was keeping it from happening only because they were there with guns, not necessarily because they were effective. Although I'm going to say at times the U.S. military's mission changed. At times there was quite a bit of working with the Afghans to make a better Afghanistan, and at times that message and that mission changed. Both, as it was reported, but even within the U.S. military, it seems that many people in the military have reflected that, my first tour in Afghanistan, this was our mission. I went back 2 years later, and I had a totally different mission, even though I was in the same region and nominally had the same job, right? So, how much of the failure in Afghanistan, and if you want to call it a failure, I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily willing to go there yet. I mean, it was a foreseeable outcome. We were eventually going to have to leave. But the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was foreseeable, and this was a reasonably foreseeable consequence, because without the U.S. military presence, were the Afghan people, given their history, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but given the history in the region, were they going to be able to be self-governing? How would you like to have been an ethnic minority that's been suppressed, and here the U.S. is leaving? That's a hard thing to hear, considering you were at the bottom of the stick before the U.S. got there, and it's very likely you're going to go to the bottom of the stick again and not be able to really do anything to protect yourself or protect the interests of your people.
I'm definitely going to want to get back to that. As Andrew, I wanted to see if you had a follow-up on that, and I'm going to have to start. I didn't normally have a pen and paper out when these shows start, and then I can just I got to write down things I want to follow up on, and I didn't have that quite ready, so I'm gonna try to catch up on. But so as Andrew, there's a lot to unpack there. But as Andrew, do you have anything to add or thoughts?
Yeah. There certainly is. I mean, and that was one of the things that I followed shortly, because I got out of the Navy shortly after that. That was my last deployment. And from right at the beginning, there's this weird mix of not really knowing what's going on or what we're supposed to be doing or what we're going to be doing next week. We're given the orders, they come down from the admiral of the fleet. Well, I should be careful using that term. The admiral in charge of our battle group. So, and they don't like to give you a whole lot of information. It's not like they explain what is our plan here, what is the overall mission. They just tell the individual units what they're going to be doing. But at least during that entire deployment, it was all very consistent. It's like, we had a fairly clear goal that we could piece together from watching both CNN and from what our ships are actually doing. That all, and then right at the end of that is that deployment is when they started sending a bunch of the helicopters in. The Kitty Hawk you couldn't take pictures of it, nothing. It was first time in history that we would ever used an aircraft carrier to land Army troops. To land, and it turns out, we didn't know it at the time, but it turns out it was quite a lot of special forces going in, to start building up whatever they were going to do on the ground in there. And then, so, and I suspect that most of the infrastructure building that we started with was, just to support our own ground effort in there, and then it's expanded from that. After all of that, then watching the news about what was going on, it does seem like there was a lot of mixed messages, that it seemed like, trying to chase a chicken with its head cut off. It's like you had no idea where the heck it was going. It's like, wait a minute, I thought we were going this way. Nope, now we're going that way. It seemed very, very confused, and there didn't seem to be a very clear answer as to what exactly we were even doing there.
Well, and oh wow, okay, so many places we could go. Again, I'm thinking, actually, I'm going to see if we can have you back to discuss the merits of projecting American values into other countries. I think that's its own show. But I did want to touch on. You would said it. You weren't sure you were prepared, Pat, to say that it was a failure. Our presence in Afghanistan. So, explain a little bit about your views on that.
So, I mean, to be fair, we announced a withdrawal. So, the politics aside, the U.S. policy shifted to a withdrawal. That was our footing, was we will be withdrawing. If you were someone if your politics are that we were going to be perpetually or should be perpetually in Afghanistan, then that metric would be defined as failure because we've withdrawn. If your metric was a short, maybe 18-month conflict in order to remove the Taliban, kill Osama bin Laden, and depending on that metric, then also Afghanistan was a failure because it took us much longer than that, right? But ultimately, Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. The Taliban was forced to retreat. Ultimately, if we were saying our goal was to be in Afghanistan for 20 years, then we succeeded at that goal. Not the goal that I would have picked, but I mean, so there's a lot of different metrics by which we would measure success, right? If our metric was to leave Afghanistan a free, fair, open, democratic society, then we utterly failed.
Well,
but it's hard to say because we've never had a clear picture of what our goal in Afghanistan was. So that's why I'm not willing to say it's a failure. Pat's metric, sure. But I didn't sit at a table inside the Pentagon or the White House trying to draft future policy for Afghanistan.
I think that's a fair point. The metric that I think I'm using is how it was sold to me as a member of the American public, which was we are going to get it so that it's a stable country, both for our interests, because if it's a stable country, then it's one fewer refuge, one fewer places where terrorists can take refuge, which was ostensibly the problem that Osama bin Laden had been able to find refuge there, and it's also a humanitarian issue, which is an argument which is interesting because I'm on the left, which means I'm making that argument pretty frequently in my life in regards to just about everything but policy, local and domestic and foreign. But it's the first time I had really heard it used on the right. And that's not to say that the right doesn't care about these things, but the right is a lot less willing to project our power explicitly for those reasons. And that was one thing I heard on the right as to why we have to go in and get Saddam Hussein. He gassed 10,000 people. That was an argument that I heard more often on the right than on the left. And I was just like, well, why is that all of a sudden on the table? So as this was sold to me, as I recall, was we're going to try to make this a stable country, and it's also a human rights issue because now we should have gone into Darfur, Rwanda, places we didn't. So we're not. Human rights issues aren't as big in U.S. foreign policy as I'd like to think they are, or imagine ourselves really being. We're aware these things exist, and usually our response to it is tepid. few exceptions, but you know, it's okay. But we're in. We decided to go in, and once we committed, what I was sort of so now was that. Am I the only one who got the impression that that was what they were telling the American public once we were in there and starting to build permanent bases?
Yeah, America was going to be a force for the eventual democratization of the region and having a fair and open government. Problem was, we never addressed the cultural issues that are the defining features of Afghan society. What did we do? We put the people that were already the cultural elites and, you know, top rung in the social society in Afghanistan, we put them on the top rungs of the government. We perpetuated the already known inequalities in the system. We reinforced the institutions. We just did it within a framework that we said was going to be democratic, right? If you were going to, again, I don't want to pontificate on this. I'm not against using military force when necessary. There were two issues I was concerned about when we went into Afghanistan. Well, actually three. First one was how limited was our war going to be? Because I still remember troops going in December of 2001, right? We were already conducting military operations, you know, stirring up the local Afghan groups against the Taliban. Fighting the Taliban, Afghans were dying in order to aid U.S. interests in the region to overthrow the Taliban. That was their goal. Afghans died, U.S. servicemen died, special forces, ordnance was launched. Great movies about it if you want to watch a bunch of propaganda showing how great we are. But you know, those they're not documentaries, but you know, I mean, I think everybody should watch those movies, right? To see kind of how we projected, whether or not it was the reality, how we were projecting our presence there. But we stirred the hornet's nest too, starting in December, and we lit the fire. We eventually go into the country, and we were occupying it for all intents and purposes. The second problem after we do that, and going back to the first point, if you follow the policy of you broke it, you buy it, then we bought it at that point. The second issue is that how are you going to go in and teach democracy to a country with illiteracy rate that we can only estimate because of how high illiteracy is, because the educational system there doesn't embrace what we would consider traditional form of education, because literacy is not taught. Specifically, it's learning in these madrasas by rote memorization. So reading is not a skill in Afghanistan that all but a few people learn. So yeah, in places like Kabul, and you'll find a higher literacy rate. But in the regions outside of Kabul, in some of the more what we call urban centers, and there's not many in Afghanistan, by the way, you have literacy rates that, you know, sometimes approach 100% in some of the smaller villages. How are you going to actually spread democratic principles and representative forms of government when you haven't even embraced an educational system to allow those people to understand the concepts of, unless you get people there that are willing to engage in cultural immersion with these people to understand the nuances of their culture. Pashtunwali, for example, the whole idea of, among the Pashtun, people, as far as, how do you actually deal with an elder in town? How are you allowed to talk to people of a certain social rank when they're like the senior person in a village? Are you, what happens when, and I'm not saying this is just the reality of what happened. What happens when you're U.S. service personnel and you point an M4 at the tribal elder in the village, which if it happened in any other context, if it happened with another tribe, they would execute you for that affront, right? But U.S. service personnel come in, do things that in that cultural group is tantamount to the worst social offenses that committed, and it's being done at large because we're unaware of the cult. And so not only do we take potential allies and push them away, we antagonize the populace against us because we don't understand the cultural, and again, it's the normative cultural values of a place where we've gone and we're conducting warfare. I'm not saying that things didn't need to be done for the protection of U.S. service personnel, but how much of that is balanced with the needs to be aware of the society and culture you're in.
So, and then
the third thing would be,
oh, please.
do we actually have a right? Okay, go ahead. Sorry. And the third thing would be, do we actually have the right to do it? Do we have the right to go and kill Osama bin Laden? I would say absolutely. Do you have the right to go in there and kill elements of Al-Qaeda that are associated with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan? I say absolutely. Do we have the right to destroy the Taliban? Maybe. But do we have the right to occupy the country and then enforce a form of government that they may not? One thing we talk about is, United Nations involvement. I don't know the last time we actually, Afghanistan was a coalition, right? Not necessarily, right? And the coalition was pretty small. So again, it was a rejection of Western power into a region that is already ostensibly resistant and suspicious of Western projections of power. So that would be my 3 points that were probably the reason we're leaving today and calling it a failure.
So, and then I want to dovetail some of Xandring's points into this, but one question before we go on. Let's assume for a second that we had the right, and let's assume that our goal there really was what ostensibly, at least the facade of the goal was, nation building, which we've done before. I mean, that was Cuba, that was Iran, which turned out beautifully. So we've done this before. Do you think it's actually possible in Afghanistan? And if so, what would it realistically, in your view, have taken to do what ostensibly, publicly, the perception was our goal was in Afghanistan?
We would have had to embrace is it possible? Sure. But we would have had to embrace a form of government that would have been antithetical to, we would have had to maintain social distinction and class in the region until such time the society was, we can't force people to get along who don't get along. We would have had to allow people to regionalize tribally. Allow these leaders to lead in this area as they kind of saw fit with U.S. support. And we would have had to been a lot more willing to take orders from people as partners rather than dictating a lot of the policy of the region based upon U.S. military supremacy. And that would be the problem. And it would take a lot more, and I'm not saying that would have worked either, but it would have been a different plan that might have had some success attached to it. But ultimately, I think we'd be withdrawing from Afghanistan and we'd be seeing a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. Because the region, if it was socially pacified, not militarily pacified, we'd have to make the Afghani people see themselves as the Afghani people, because they typically don't. Again, we call ourselves Americans, right? Kind of a term that we all understand. And if I asked you, where are you from? You go, I'm from America. That's not how a lot of Afghanis see themselves. They don't see themselves. They're from Afghanistan, but then they immediately identify with their ethnic identifier, because that's how they see their reality, both culturally and geopolitically, right? So that's problematic. Same thing, go to Iraq, ask a Kurd if he's an Iraqi, and they say, no, I'm a Kurd. Because that's how they understand themselves, and that's how they see themselves, both ethnically and geopolitically. And Americans, we don't get it. The only Americans that maybe understand that are Texans, right?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
They don't say America.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I'm a Texan.
I'm from Texas.
But I mean, but even then, it's not something where they see themselves as not having the same goals as the rest of the United States. But in Afghanistan, your cultural and ethnic identifier largely limits you both socially, but also it frames your entire geopolitical worldview. And again, when I say geopolitical, it's probably just the area you live in. And so when someone comes in and tells you, oh, we're here now, you have to be friends with the people that have been, coming into town every 6 months and forcibly taking your men to go out and perform labor as effectively a forced slave population, I don't know how you sell that.
So, Xandring, we had discussed this earlier. First of all, Xandring had brought up an interesting point a while back on off time, where the United States was actually, in fact, that was the idea. We were separate states, each state essentially its own country when this was first founded. So people didn't identify as Americans; they identified as Virginians or whatever state they were from, and it was a essentially a union of a federation over union of the states. So I think in that context, I do see it, and the Texas is a great example. So is answering sort of roughly the same question, and we've been talking about this. So if the U.S. was engaged in nation building there, what do you think was, did we have any success? What was the follies? Where are we now relative to where we went in? And was this inevitable?
Well, I think given the policies that we pursue, this was inevitable. I think they could have mitigated quite a lot of the damage that we did with the quite erratic and unplanned, or seemingly unplanned, withdrawal that we made. There's a lot of people that helped us, green card holders, and there's quite a few people left behind that probably shouldn't have been and didn't need to have been. I mean, it was a disaster of our own making because of the way that we did it. And, it's hard, and it's hard to watch. I think ultimately, given the policies that we pursued in the area, was it going to collapse and revert back to, essentially revert to the mean? More than likely. But if we wanted to at least have a hope of success, we needed to go into it with the intention to build a state that could be stable. And I see no evidence that any of our policies had that intention. We built up and trained an Afghan military that was wholly dependent upon U.S. contractors for maintenance, support, supply, etc., and the U.S. military. We trained them in a way of fighting, the way that we fight, which is ground, well, at least on the ground, with close air support. So if you start getting into trouble, you have that air support coming in to help you out. And when we just decided to leave, we just took all of that stuff away. It's like, I don't understand how you would have expected the military. I mean, even assuming that we're going to say, okay, these are the top guys, these are the guys that are dominating anyway, we're going to put them in power, kind of antithetical to what we think of, the United States as a stable country. But in an area like that, many of the countries that actually become stable, at least stabilized, they need kind of strong men, strong militaries to be able to keep everybody in line, especially when you have such disparate ethnic and religious people living side to side that aren't a cohesive unit or don't see themselves as a cohesive whole. And we didn't do any of that. We made them completely dependent upon us. So, of course, as soon as we left, everything was going to collapse. The last year and a half has been relatively stable. Well, actually, about the last 6-7 years have been relatively stable for the area. There's been no combat casualties in the last year and a half in Afghanistan. So, you can make it stable, but we don't have any interest in that, because if we made them, the government and the military strong enough to keep the country stable, or at least more or less stable. I mean, there's still going to be issues that crop up, but if, we would need to leave essentially a strong man with a strong military with enough power to be able to quell those or at least contain them. And we're not interested in doing that. There's no evidence that we were interested in doing something like that. Because of course, as soon as we do that, they can now tell us that we don't need you anymore. You can go away. We're going to go ally with Russia, or we're going to go ally with China because, they're offering us a better deal or whatever. So we have to leave them dependent upon us so that they won't, decide to go with someone else, so that they'll still continue to serve our interests. Which is what it boils down to, is, why in most foreign policies, they're there to serve the interests of the country, not necessarily to serve the interests of everybody else. Otherwise, why would you be there? So I don't see that we ever really pursued any policies that could have been successful. I think that it might have been possible to at least stabilize the region, but it wouldn't have been palatable to most, people who grew up in a free, more or less free nation. There still would have been quite a lot of suppressing of other people going on, which, in other areas of the world, we seem to be perfectly fine with, and don't have any problems working with countries like that. So there just doesn't seem to be any real, and I don't think it's for lack of trying on some of the Afghanis either. I mean, the Afghanistan military was taking thousands of casualties fighting back against, like, the Taliban, for example. The U.S. taking very few casualties, and like I said, in the last year and a half, no combat casualties, while thousands of Afghanistan soldiers were dying. So it pisses me off that the administration is trying to claim that essentially the Afghani people were just cowards and they'd rolled over. You took away the entire form that they had learned to fight in, all the support for it. It's like, what did you expect was going to happen? So we didn't pursue any kind of viable goal to create any kind of stabilized nation, regardless of how you were going to try and do it.
So, Pat, it looked like you were going to say something. Yeah.
I also think we underestimated the cultural memory of the average Afghani to the terror that the Taliban had rained upon them. We assumed that, given our 20-year occupation and the fact that we had, helped beat up the Taliban on occasion and giving the quote-unquote Afghan military some victories against the Taliban, that we were going to erase a legacy of really terror that had been brought upon the Afghan people by the Taliban. And I think we misestimated that. I think the Afghani people lived in fear of not only, like during our occupation, not only us in some ways, and I'm speaking us as the U.S. military, but they never forgot who the Taliban were. And I think ultimately they were more afraid of the Taliban than they were us. They had a legacy of terror. And that makes it really hard for, it's one thing to say, yeah, stand up on your own 2 feet and fight. But, that's easy to say. It's a lot of bravado is easy when you're not looking down the barrel of an AK. And it's not just you; it's everybody in your village is going to pay for your "quote unquote" your apparent disrespect to this group that is extremely good in guerrilla and nonlinear warfare. They are a army of terror, and they're very good at it.
And it's also easy to stand up to them when you have the might of the U.S. military and support of the U.S. military behind you. That if there's a big flare up of Taliban someplace, you can, if you can just hold out long enough for the U.S. military to arrive, they will help you. And now that's gone. All the support's gone. Half of they can't fight the same way. The way we were teaching them to fight, they can no longer fight that way because we just removed all the support for their Air Force that we sold them. I'm not sure where Afghanistan really got the money to do that, to actually buy planes from us, but they had an Air Force and they couldn't really use it because we all left and we took away all of their support. Now they're facing this cultural terror on their own. It's so much easier to check your closet for monsters when mommy's with you. Not so easy to do it on your own.
Well, and it would, again, I wonder in the United States if U.S. law enforcement and military personnel, while they were doing their job, had to worry about the very people that they were doing their job against, knowing who their friends and family were, and had the ability to reach into their homes and not only retaliate against the soldiers and law enforcement in the field, but against their families who are in most systems, non-combatants. But that's not how that type of warfare of terror is fought in that region of the world. Your being in the military is you're not only responsible for what you do, you're also, that is to project onto your family and the people that are extended to the third and fourth degree of blood and relations. This is how tribal societies operate. And it's we think it's abhorrent, but we're not the ones having to fight in that region against their own people and their own cultural group either. We have and I hate to say call it a luxury, but we have the luxury to go home.
So you're Biden, you're looking at this. Trump has promised that he's going to get every American out. He has set a deadline. He's going to get all the troops out. It's going to end it. you're Biden. You come into office. We're gonna Monday morning quarterback here. What did he do right, wrong? What should he have done? What, you know? So either one of you, wherever. Well, let's start with Pat.
Start with me.
Yeah.
So
Start
I
with
get
you.
to write an entire Afghan exit policy.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
First, okay.
And please do so in
Pros
the
and
next
cons.
30 seconds.
no,
Yeah, pros and cons. Yeah, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stall for time so you can think about it and write a reasoned response. But pros and cons
no,
here. Pros, you already know
I'm good.
what was done. Cons,
I think
we can't test it against reality.
I think if Biden's goal was to have a stable Afghanistan upon exiting, he did not. It was not. Ultimately, he designed too many scenarios where this type of failure was too likely of an outcome. Should we have left Afghanistan? I don't know. I think a military presence in Afghanistan, a permanent military presence, is something we should have considered. And I know that's not a very popular opinion, but we invaded a country. We affected it both economically, socially, politically, and militarily for 2 decades. We attained at least some of the goals that we wanted, as far as, with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And if we could have continued to build, and if a reasonably small or reasonably sized military presence in Afghanistan would have given the stability to the Afghan government that they needed, then we should have stayed. I mean, no one complains that we have military bases in the world. For some reason, no one has problems with us having troops in Germany and Japan and military bases throughout the world to project our strategic interests. If we had a strategic interest in Afghanistan before 9/11, immediately after 9/11, and up to a few years ago, does that military, do we take the hard lesson of history and say, if we're going to stay, then we commit? But we commit in a way that you have to work with the Afghan people, not against them and not on top of them. And I see that largely as a failure. And I think Biden largely failed because accepting Trump's policy is to accept Trump's outlook and view. Now, I don't necessarily agree, but I don't even think military were in too big a support, because they could see the longer. But then again, if leaving Afghanistan was your goal and that's the policy and direction, then ultimately you can't call this a failure other than it's a failure for the Afghan people. Our troops are gone. In that small metric, we've succeeded. Now, one of the reasonably foreseeable consequences have come to fruition, and we're not paying that price. The Afghan people are.
Let me actually, just while you
Although
I do want to have Xander, but I wanted to.
All to be fair, U.S. service people did die. I mean, we paid a price too for the exit. I mean, but the long term, beyond this point, it will be the Afghani people.
One of the first women ever elected to a mayoral position, elected after the Taliban had been ejected. She was the first female mayor of Madin Shah, and this was obviously a position she could not hold during of Taliban. She was obviously progressive, and when the U.S. left, they made no plans for her. She was moved to the as the Taliban was recapturing Afghanistan. She was moved to the defense ministry, but eventually that fell. So she was interviewed by the New York Times. Said that I am, quote, I am sitting here waiting for them to come. There is no one to help me or my family. I am sitting with them. I am sitting with my husband. And they will come for people like me, and they will kill me, she said. I cannot leave my family, and anyways, where would I go? Decided to violate Sharia law and do more than get an education. Actually became mayor. And she was the first woman to hold office at all in her entire province. And she had been optimistic. She said, young people were learning that you could fight and resist, and it was a future for this country and a future for women in the country. She was saying that within weeks before Afghanistan fell, and it became, when it finally conquered, she realized there was nothing she could do. There was nowhere she could go. This was reported just a day after Afghanistan had fallen. Taliban knew who she was. She had made some waves, and she vanished. She was found 2 days later, alive in Germany. Germans had come and they had snagged her and they had gotten her out. So it is a story with a happy ending, but for the fact that we did not get her out. Just left, and I don't think, but for us, she would have even gotten that position. So I think that speaks to a number of points. If I do want to, I felt that would fit at this point. So as Andring, what was your? What are you going to say?
Oh, I said it's not. Obviously they had the suicide bombing that killed 13 Americans and killed a lot of Afghanis. But beyond that, even into the future, it's not just Afghanis that are going to suffer. They're going to suffer, obviously, the overwhelming brunt of the issues. But we made quite a lot of promises that we broke, and people looking around, going, well, crap, they like this lady. I'm very thankful that she was able to get out. But we left a hell of a lot of people that we promised, hey, if you help us, which is going to make you targets should the Taliban or other strongmen come back, if we leave, we're going to help you out. So you help us, we'll help you. And we're not being particularly successful at helping them. I mean, we got some people out, but it was such a chaotic mess that I still don't think they know exactly who all they actually got out of there. And it just seemed, if your goal was to leave Afghanistan, even if that was your sole mission, was just to get our military out, stop. It's like, we need to stop having a presence here. I would still hesitate to even call that a success. I mean, on the surface, it certainly is, because we're not there anymore. But the kinds of damage we did to our own reputation, the kind of damage we did to our own citizens, I mean, the number of suicide helplines, the number of people, especially Afghanistan veterans, calling suicide hotlines, because people that they worked closely with, that they put their lives in their hands and trusted them to help them to survive their Afghanistan conflicts, are being left there, and the fact that the people on the ground were making promises to them that got broken. The government made a bunch of these people into liars, and so I still even hesitate to call it an actual success, even if that was just the goal. And I'm not, the cost, especially over the last, 5-6 years, and especially within the last year and a half, the cost of leaving a fairly minor force of, U.S. troops there, maintaining the air base, which I'm not, the way that we exited, I just don't understand. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. We had a perfectly good air base outside of Kabul. It was defensible. There were so many other things that could have been done to make it a much more orderly withdrawal and take the people that we needed to take with us. Even if we were going to say, okay, we're done, we're out of here, at least the people that we made commitments to, we had the ability to get them out and do so in a secure and organized manner. And we didn't do any of that. I mean, it just seemed to crumble into an absolute shit show, and very hard to watch. And of course, because it happened over there and not someplace that we can see a lot of, if the media just stops covering it at all, it won't take too long before something else captures, the general population's attention, and we kind of forget about Afghanistan because it's not, we're not having to really deal with it. But I think that it hurts our foreign interests, the way we went about it. And I just think that it was, I consider a failure, even if your only goal was just to get out.
Well, there was a comment in the live chat, which is China has gotten extraordinarily good at projecting soft power. They filled a soft power gap. Started really with Trump, extraordinarily bad one. They were ready. They were absolutely ready for it, and have outpaced us in that. And they will certainly, I think, be trying to take advantage of stuff. But anybody have any thoughts as to why this was done so poorly? Did Biden just fuck it up? Did he get bad advice? Did he not take it seriously? Or any? This has to be wild speculation at this point. When somebody read something, but I had. It seemed to me that he hit the ground running with this, so you'd think he'd have been prepared and would have expected this. I do know that they thought it would take, I think it was 6 weeks to 6 months for the Taliban to take over, and it took 2 weeks. 2 weeks for them to conquer the entire country. And we thought, we thought worst case scenario, like unimaginably, like negative worst case projections was 6 weeks, and we were thinking closer to 6 months. So it was. Did he just not see that coming, or what?
You're muted.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Nick. I think that's just a little bit too much of just punditry from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. Because if your goal is, wow, it collapsed faster than we thought, the ultimate realization is you realized it was going to collapse. I mean, and I think that whole thing is kind of it's really a red herring. Oh, well, we didn't realize it was going to collapse so fast. The death of the country of Afghanistan, as we saw it, it died. It died faster than we expected. That's really the only consequence we're dealing with here. And I would just, it's more of a question to ask the audience and let them reflect on it. But, we have tens of thousands of troops in Korea to maintain that, in South Korea. We have tens of thousands of troops projected throughout the world in various degrees and levels of harm's way. Was Afghanistan a part of the world that the United States military should have been involved in to ensure the security and continuity of the Afghan government as a regional ally? If that answer is yes, then we shouldn't have left. But if more Americans than not think it wasn't, then, that's part of the world we live in. Were the Afghanis going to learn democracy in a decade to 2 decades? I don't think so. And I think this is one of those miscarriages of history. We got democracy within a very short time. Well, we had democracy from the outset. We knew what democratic principles were, in a parliamentary monarchical system. When for the first, again, I'm using America, colonialism, we won't talk about colonialist movements and all that, issues. But the government of the United States had a history of democracy long before the founders of the Declaration of Independence put pen to paper. Self-rule is not something you learn overnight. Just think from the Magna Carta forward, what, if we're going to use Western Europe, went through in order to obtain knowledge and cultural normality of self-rule. And we expect the Afghanis to do that in 2 decades. We're fooling ourselves. And that's the historian in me talking. But, that's the problem. So we need to think what our long-term goal was there. Was it just a military occupation? If it was nation building, then nation building, we should have planned on being there for 50 years at minimum.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first, as Nick mentioned, I've talked about, around the founding of the United States. When the Constitution was they're trying to ratify the Constitution, people weren't considering themselves Americans. I was a Virginian, I was from South Carolina. They identified with their own states, and one of the reasons that the Constitution was eventually set up the way that it was with the Senate and the House of Representatives is they figured that people would maintain that allegiance to their own state, and it took about 100 years before people considered themselves Americans before right around the time of the Civil War, I guess. Really helped kind of cement that as we're Americans, not necessarily a Virginian or a Connecticut. or New Yorker. So that took almost 100 years, and we've only been there for 20. You want to integrate people into one cohesive country. It's going to take time to get them to identify as a cohesive country. They have to actually be acting in a cohesive manner in order for that identity to kind of to start to sink in. I mean, if I don't know what people, I'm not in the administration, so I don't know what they're thinking or what they're actually getting at. But I do know that what they're telling us they wanted and what they were getting at and what actually happened and what they did don't seem to line up. So I don't know what the thought process was going on there. And the only thing I can think of is that polls show that it's politically advantageous to want to try and pull out of Afghanistan. Because when you look at the polls, most people agree that we should get out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But to call Afghanistan a never-ending war, which I hear all of the time too, especially from the administration, Biden said it many times. Get out of this endless war. It's like, well, then you're going to have to consider South Korea an endless war, and Germany an endless war. We've been in Germany since World War II. Been in Korea since the Korean War. Been in Japan since the Second World War. And it's like all of those must be never-ending wars. So and people don't have a problem with it. And I think the only reason that people have a problem with us being in Afghanistan was because the first part of the Afghanistan ground offensive, we were getting quite a lot of casualties. It took a while to stabilize things and get to the point where we could have more or less a skeleton amount of people, military personnel on the ground to keep things more or less stable. And I don't get. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because, like I said, what we're being told is the goal and what the actions reflect don't seem to line up.
All right. Well, gentlemen, it's been about 2 hours, so thank you, Pat. Thank you so much for coming. I did want to ask, was there anything else that you wanted to say as we wrap this up on the topic at hand, or anything that we missed that you wanted to clarify, or any final put forth there?
Well, I would just encourage people to, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it gives us overarching themes for analysis. And hopefully sometime we won't have to have conversations like this. But again, if disappointing allies is what we don't want to do, then U.S. policy needs to be completely revamped. But the U.S. public will have to understand what that means long term. The Afghans are definitely not the first and likely not the last people to be quote unquote disappointed by our failure to follow through on promises. So we have a long-standing history of it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think that requires sacrifice. That we've gotten to consider the sacrifices that we put into World War II versus what nowadays we consider a sacrifice for people won't put on masks, and we're losing people faster than we did during World War II. And a mask is too much of a sacrifice. I don't. Maintaining our commitments is a sacrifice that Americans, I think, really kind of want it all at this point. So, Andrew, what are your thoughts? Final thoughts on this?
I think my final thoughts are the United States and the United States people need to figure out what they're going to be. The tendency for large global powers to become empires throughout history seems to be a pretty strong trend, and the United States needs to decide if it's going to be an isolationist nation and stay out of everybody else's business, still be defensive. If you screw with us, we'll just wipe you off the face of the earth, but otherwise leave you alone. You don't screw with us, we won't screw with you. Or are we going to be a force for trying to bring more of the Western liberal values to the world, if we believe that's a good thing? And compared to many of the places around the world, I think that it would be a good thing. So we need to decide what we're going to do. It's like, if we're going to get involved in places like this, then we need to get involved with like we mean it, or we need to keep the hell out. We end up with this mismatch of God knows what goes on, and nobody seems to win when we can't make up our mind. So we need to figure out what we want to do, or we're going to get caught in the middle and get the worst of everything.
Yeah, that was, so I was going to play. There was a great clip from the newsroom. It was season 1. It was the opener about why America is the greatest country in the world, and I think it's arguable that it was America ever the greatest country in the world. I don't. It's amazing that even saying that could be such a trigger. Anyways, in prepping for the show, we did a test run and we played it, and unfortunately, it got flagged pretty seriously by HBO, which is, and we've had problems with HBO on this channel before. We've shown clips from HBO that in fact do follow fair use, and HBO has still actually had it taken down, and it's been a certifiable nightmare getting shows back up, even when legal are completely right. We've gotten it done, but it usually takes 2 days. The most common one was when we actually what was it? Bill Maher. The Bill Maher had the. Oh, excuse me, 1 second here. Bill Maher had the. No, Bill Maher had the. What was it? He had on what's his name? The anti-theist Sam Harris, and they discussed Islam, and we decided to discuss that engagement here on the show. And as we were trying to discuss it, HBO took us down while we were streaming, and eventually got it back up because we were having a discussion on that content. And at any rate, so I did not. I was actually considering. I was thinking now as I was talking. I was looking to see if I actually have that companion play it. Well, if we play it, what ends up happening is they take the stream down within 5 minutes, and then I have to fight for a couple of days to get it back up. But you know what? I think it works. So let me find it real quick. Give me a minute. I'll find it and I'll put it in consequences in a few minutes. The show has already aired, but I think it's going to fall under fair use. So Pat, where can people find you? We put your information in the description there. So
well, I have a blog where I put some of my academic writings in a little more easy to digest format on my blog for people to look at. They're a little shortened, less annotated. But I also just recently launched a YouTube channel where I don't talk about anything about modern politics, but do some archaeological touring of Scotland and Wales and Cornwall, and so a series of short videos showing what I do as an archaeologist and a historian. Those, I'm sure Nick can throw those up, but the YouTube channel is Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger, and to keep things simple, my blog is Discovering Ancient History at WordPress.com. So
and
if I go and watch your videos and subscribe to your channel, all that fun stuff, I had better see you with a pretty awesome hat and a bullwhip, or I'm going to be very disappointed.
Do not do that.
Do I want to wait? What did I miss?
Indiana Jones was an archaeologist.
I can't believe that went over my head. Well, I've spoken with Pat while he's been on digs too, and he's sitting on it. Nick, it's raining. Help me! I was just like, that dude. Nope, not raining over here. But even if it was, I'm indoors. I'm not in a tent. All right. Yeah, if you folks can give me 1 minute, yeah, I think I'm gonna set this up because I disabled it, so I'm gonna set this up. So, yeah, what was the archaeology? What was the where were you just? And I'm trying to remember where you had just been, and you just got back.
I was actually in Wales when I called you. I was out on Anglesey when the rainstorm happened, and we got like 2 inches of rain in like 6 hours and flooded me out my tent. And we stayed, but yeah, I was doing a site survey there.
Oh, well, I forget. Yeah, I've learned
There's a lot
about
of
your.
rain.
We were on. Oh, okay, and I may have reached about the limit of what I can do for chatting. All right, well, Pat, thank you very much for joining us. And tomorrow.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure.
And-
I'm sorry. Were you going to say something? Did I cough you out there?
No, I wanted to say take your time.
Yeah, let's have you back. There's a couple of. Thanks. Yeah, Oh, that was a long one, but so tomorrow we are going to be doing overtime. That's going to be back. Got Joe, Serious Mind, going to be on discussing everything that's been going on. Speaking of topics that are taking up the consciousness, this show was supposed to be done about 2 weeks ago, and already, it's like everyone wants to talk about the abortion issue, wants to talk about Texas, and I think this is important. I'd like to try to get Nate. So we're going to see if we can get Nate on to discuss all of that. But either way, yes, the U.S. is already moving on. So overtime will be tomorrow. We'll do a rundown. And then Friday, we're going to do After Dark. It's going to be a call-in show. Anyone who wants to call in. I am thinking I'm going to see if I can reach out to the Free Thought Project, and we had a discussion on Twitter about the use of mockery, and not just mockery, but humiliation as an educational tool against theists. I think I have a few disagreements on it, so we may have. I'm going to see if I can get them on for that. But either way, people call in. Yeah, it's going to be. Yeah, so I don't know if you follow me on Twitter, but that one got. I was not well, so I had to. We'll have that discussion. So that'll be Thursday, and then we got a few other good shows planned. Yes, please.
It may not be effective, but it's fun. That's as far as mockery. I'm just.
Oh Jesus! Listen, it's fun. It's cathartic. Listen. I will not disagree that it is, and I'll make this argument too. It's look. First of all, we all. What is it? Humor is tragedy from the other side of the street. As much as I hate to say it, there are really only two things I think that people find funny: logical juxtapositions of some kind, or suffering. The suffering of other people in one way or another. It's the best comedians make fun of themselves, the best. So and humiliating, mocking other people is cathartic. It's fun, and I'm not going to sit there and say that it's always a bad idea. And certainly, it is also the effective tool against tyrants. And you want to sit there and say that the Pope is a tyrant? Yeah, I would agree with you. So, but if you're talking about educating people and deconverting, or not deconverting, but trying to get people to challenge their beliefs, you're talking about it's not an educational tool. Talking education, it is not in my view. So maybe we'll have that discussion. Who knows? It was interesting. It got lively. So we'll see. Anyone who wants to come join us is Andring. Either of you, Pat. It's an open hang. People can just show up, and I'll call up Amy Newman, coach all her people. Hey, come on, everybody! If Amy's doing a show, you want to be fine, and we'll do that. But anyways. So that is the schedule for this week. We got a few other interesting things planned, but in the meantime, thank you all for joining us. And I did keep up that clip. I'm prepared to put it at the end of the show, so see if I can produce and host at the same time. Over under on that is no. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all later. I'll probably be later tonight, Pat. If have a question for you. That would be great. I'm going to go. It's a school night. Oh, it's late. I'm going to check in on the family, and then I'll bye. Thank you all again, and we will catch you all tomorrow.
Junior, and my question's for Will McAvoy. Do you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent?
I consider myself a New York Jets fan, Stephen. Since it's been brought up, you've almost religiously avoided stating or even implying a political allegiance. Is that because, as a news anchor, you feel the integrity of your broadcast would be compromised?
That sounds like a good answer. I'll take it.
There was a short piece on Vanity Fair's website by Marshall Westbrook, you probably saw it, where he calls you the Jay Leno of news anchors. You're popular because you don't bother anyone.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Jealous of the size of Jay's audience.
Are you willing to say here tonight whether you lean right or left?
I've voted for candidates run by both major parties.
Let's move on to the next question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm a sophomore, and this is for all three of you. Can you say in one sentence or less what... you know what I mean. Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Diversity and opportunity.
Lewis?
Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
Will?
The New York Jets.
No, I'm going to hold you to an answer on that. What makes America the greatest country in the world?
Well, Lewis and Sharon said it. Diversity and opportunity and freedom and freedom. You don't look satisfied.
I want a human moment from you. What about the people? Why is America
Not the greatest country in the world, Professor. That's my answer.
You're saying...
Yes.
Let's talk about...
Fine. Sharon, the NEA is a loser. Yeah, it accounts for a penny out of our paycheck, but he gets to hit you with it anytime he wants. It doesn't cost money. It costs votes. It costs airtime and column inches. You know why people don't like liberals? Because they lose. If liberals are so fucking smart, how come they lose so goddamn always? Hey, and with a straight face, you're gonna tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom? Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium has freedom. So 207 sovereign states in the world, like 180 of them have freedom.
All right.
And yeah, you, sorority girl, just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know. And one of them is, there is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst generation ever. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Yosemite? Sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. We fought for moral reasons. We passed laws, struck down laws for moral reasons. We waged wars on poverty, not poor people. We sacrificed. We cared about our neighbors. We put our money where our mouths were, and we never beat our chest. We built great big things, made ungodly technological advances, explored the universe, cured diseases, and we cultivated the world's greatest artists and the world's greatest economy. We reached for the stars, acted like men. We aspired to intelligence. We didn't belittle it. It didn't make us feel inferior. We didn't identify ourselves by who we voted for in the last election, and we didn't scare so easy. We were able to be all these things and do all these things because we were informed by great men, men who were revered. First step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. America is not the greatest country in the world anymore. Enough?